What's up guys, Vress here, and today I want to share with you what I believe to be the best MMORPGs for casual players. This top 5 is aimed at those of you who want to jump into a game and enjoy the content without having to commit thousands of hours to it. I've deliberately listed games that don't feature a particularly steep learning curve, at least not to reach a comfortable level for both solo and casual group content. They also provide a good amount of what you could call quality of life features that will help casual players to enjoy the game without having to spend countless hours grinding. Just to be clear, I'm not saying that these games don't offer more hardcore content if you want it. It's just that this video is purely about looking at it from a casual player's perspective. I'm going to give a bit of an overview of each game, but I have taken a deeper look at most of these games in separate videos, which I'll link in the description down below. As always, this list is based on my own personal opinion, and I'm looking forward to hearing yours in the comments. Anyway, with that out of the way, let's dive right in. At number 5 we have Black Desert Online, an Eastern title that came to the West in 2016. And unlike most Eastern MMOs, it's actually done fairly well in the West. BDO is by far the best looking game on this list, at least from a pure graphical perspective. Whether you enjoy the art style or not is of course a matter of personal taste. I spent a lot of my time in game just wandering around and taking in the beautiful scenery. Occasionally stopping to cave in a few monster skulls, of course. Speaking of which, if you're looking for fast-paced action combat that isn't painfully difficult to learn but that still offers a good amount of depth, then this game could be a nice option for you. Even as someone who isn't a massive fan of this combat system, I have to admit that it can be immensely satisfying to carve a path through dozens of enemies at a time. The story can be a little hit and miss. There were times that I found myself really enjoying it and could feel myself being drawn into the narrative. However, there were other times when I was convinced that certain things must have been lost in translation, as there were moments where the storytelling felt a little awkward and just totally failed to capture my interest. However, a definite plus for casual players is that the story does allow you to progress pretty much entirely on your own. You only really have to group up with other players if it's something that you want to do. This is of course important if you don't want to be forced into playing around other people's schedules. The main story also serves as a decent introduction to the various in-game systems, and it sets you up nicely to enjoy the game beyond just questing, which is actually kind of the point with BDO. The game features an in-depth life skilling system in which you can own housing, employ workers, trade between towns, and throw together anything from simple meals to your very own ship. These different systems can take some time to get used to, and there's definitely something of a learning curve there. However, as a casual player, you have no reason to rush things. Everything will click into place soon enough. Interestingly, you can even perform certain actions such as fishing when you're away from your computer. This is a nice feature for casual players who don't have the time to sit there and grind all day, but would still like to make some progress. Be warned though, that doesn't mean that BDO isn't a grindy game. In fact, it can be incredibly grindy if you want to obtain all of the best equipment, especially if you want to get it quickly. In terms of group content, Black Desert Online doesn't feature traditional dungeons and raids. Instead, you can group up to take on different challenges in the open world. Personally, I'm not a big fan of this, as I'm more of a semi-casual player and I quite enjoy challenging dungeon and raid content. However, if you're a casual player who doesn't want to be denied loot just because you're not interested in dungeons or raids, this game could be a really nice fit. Finally, you could choose to take part in the large-scale PvP battles that are a big feature of the game. Though, to become seriously involved in guild versus guild PvP, you're probably going to start moving outside of the realms of what would be considered casual by most players. Either way, PvP is a big part of the game, and it's definitely worth digging deeper to see if it's something you fancy getting into. Of course, this is only a brief overview of what's available in Black Desert Online, and I'll link my more detailed first impressions video in the description. The next game on our list is Star Wars: The Old Republic. Now, before you start throwing rotten fruit at me, please allow me to explain. The Old Republic really isn't as dead as a lot of people think it is. Yes, it's true that the game didn't even come close to achieving the player numbers that it had hoped for. It's also true that it's pretty much failed to capture the interest of the hardcore MMO crowd with its endgame dungeons and raids. But you know what? Why do any of those things matter to the casual player? If you don't care about the factors I've just listed and you're just looking for an immersive story that you can enjoy either on your own or with a group of friends, then the Old Republic might actually have a lot to offer you, especially if you're a big fan of the Star Wars universe. Some people even feel that the storytelling that features in-game is actually better than that featured in some of the more recent films, but I'm going to stay well clear of that debate. In the Old Republic, each class has its own unique storyline for you to play through, and though I haven't played through every single one of them, I've been really impressed with the ones that I have played. The storytelling's top notch as far as MMOs are concerned. You can definitely tell that an enormous amount of resources have been poured into crafting the main storylines. The voice acting is a particularly nice touch and goes a long way in helping you to achieve that sense of adventure and feeling of immersion in the Star Wars universe. The combat consists of fairly standard MMO style tab targeting, with a bit of added flair due to the inclusion of lightsabers, blasters and fancy maneuvers involving jetpacks. I've personally found the combat to be pretty smooth and enjoyable, though if you're heavily into action-based combat systems then it may not gel with you. It's a lot more akin to games like World of Warcraft than something like Black Desert Online in that regard. Graphically, the game's still pretty impressive considering that it launched in 2011, and the in-game scenes are likely going to float your boat if you're a Star Wars fan. It's not like the game's some kind of ghost town either, people are still playing it and it's still actively being developed. Sure, it's not enjoying anywhere near the figures of the more popular MMOs such as World of Warcraft and Final Fantasy XIV, but as a casual player I think you'll find more than enough people to interact with. I do want to warn you about one thing before we move on though. The Old Republic's free-to-play model is a bit of a joke. If you want to fully experience this game, you're going to have to subscribe. And I'm not talking about convenience features either, there's actually a lot of core stuff that you can't really access without subscribing. Now I've got no problem whatsoever with sub-based MMOs, but trying to disguise a game as free to play when it really isn't does leave a bit of a sour taste. I don't want to leave a negative impression in your minds, as I think the game has a lot to offer, but I promised when I started this channel that my videos would always be totally honest, and this is in my opinion one of the biggest mistakes the developers have made with the Old Republic. Moving on to World of Warcraft, a game that depending on who you ask can be slated as either too hardcore or too casual. Now this seems like a total contradiction, but in reality it isn't really that contradictory at all, as World of Warcraft can cater to both audiences. The reason that people call the game too hardcore is likely because of the thriving endgame raiding scene that does require a lot of time and commitment to become competitive in. The reason that people call it too casual is usually because they've come from games like the original EverQuest, and they don't approve of all the quality of life features that have made World of Warcraft so appealing to the more casual audience. So what does WoW have to offer this more casual group of players? Well, firstly, there's the questing experience. You'll notice that I'm calling it the questing experience rather than the main storyline, as it doesn't necessarily follow a single thread. In World of Warcraft, you can move from zone to zone, picking and choosing the quests that you want to take part in. These quests usually form part of the story of that zone, which in turn feeds into the wider story of what's going on in the Warcraft universe. This actually gives a lot of flexibility and freedom, and it can be particularly enjoyable if you're the kind of player who just wants to wander around and explore. However, if you want to experience a more linear plot and become wrapped up in a main story that takes you from level 1 all the way to level cap, then World of Warcraft might not be the right fit for you. This is hopefully going to improve with the recently announced changes to the leveling experience, but right now it does feel very disjointed. And to be honest, you often feel like you're not following a wider plot at all. These changes are coming with patch 7.3.5, which is potentially only a few days away, so these improvements could already be in place by the time you watch this video. Outside of questing, you can participate in group content such as dungeons and battlegrounds. Dungeons offer one difficulty setting while leveling, at least if you queue with the dungeon finder, and it's not particularly challenging even as a casual player. This has actually changed a lot since the early days of WoW, where casual players would spend hours trying to complete even the lowest level dungeons. Even after reaching max level, you can still participate in far easier versions of dungeons and raids than the hardcore players are taking part in. In fact, WoW is probably one of the few games in which you can experience all of the raiding content without having to be a serious raider. This is due to the significantly easier versions of raids that are available through the game's LFR system. I also mentioned battlegrounds, which you're able to enjoy as a casual player if PvP is what you're looking for. Gear is still a factor in WoW PvP, but it's nowhere near as impactful as it used to be, which to be honest goes a long way in giving casual players a chance to compete. However, you will find that arenas and rated battlegrounds are catered more towards the hardcore PvP crowd. On top of all this, there are a huge amount of achievements that you can hunt in WoW, as well as collectibles that you can pick up. Some people actually spend all their time in game just collecting items and achievements, and this is something that you can easily take part in as a casual player. Though be warned, you may struggle to get every single achievement as a casual player. Some of them do involve raiding and rated PvP. It really is difficult to cover everything that WoW has to offer in this brief description, and I'd definitely suggest doing your own research too. One final thing to mention is that the game does require a monthly subscription to play, so you're going to need to decide whether that's going to be worth it to you as a casual player. If you're totally new to WoW, I've actually covered a few questions that are commonly asked by new players in a separate video, which I'll link in the description. Coming in at number 2, we have The Elder Scrolls Online, a game that I admittedly keep banging on about being one of the most underrated MMOs on the market. This, in my opinion, is mostly due to the game's very turbulent launch that caused many people to lose faith. However, the developers have worked hard to improve the game experience, and now it has a lot to offer, especially for casual players. The big draw when it comes to ESO is its storyline, which isn't a massive surprise considering that it's an Elder Scrolls game. Rather than having to mess around killing 10 spiders or gathering apples for an extremely lazy NPC who's standing about 2 meters away from the tree, you actually start your game experience right in the middle of the action. Depending on whether you buy the Morrowind expansion or not, you'll either be escaping from the plains of Oblivion or from the grasp of slavers who want to sell you for profit. This really sets a pace that continues throughout the main story, and you'll find that even the side quests are far more engaging than those that feature in most other MMOs. Don't go in expecting Skyrim Online though. If you're hoping for that level of detail and polish, then you're going to end up disappointed. Technical limitations mean that the experience in ESO is a little more restrictive when it comes to the way that you interact with the world. I'd definitely suggest going into the game with an open mind and not expecting a typical Elder Scrolls title. The game offers a decent balance of PvE and PvP content that I found fairly accessible while playing casually. Obviously, if you want to become the best at either competitive PvP or endgame dungeons and raids, then you're going to have to put a lot more time in. But on the whole, there's plenty to experience even if you can only play for a few hours each week. I found combat to be a bit of a touchy subject when it comes to ESO. Some people absolutely love it, whereas others just can't seem to get on with it. I've been criticised in the past for not knowing the intimate details of ESO combat, but to be honest, that positions me perfectly to describe it from a casual player's perspective. My opinion is that the combat system can feel a little floaty and disjointed at first, but once you get used to it, it can become very rewarding and feel far more fluid. It really just comes down to personal preference. Honestly, I think the best thing you can do is give it a chance and find out for yourself. One final note on ESO is that if you want to try it out, then you're either going to have to wait for a free weekend or just take the risk and buy the game. There's an optional subscription model, but in this case, it really is optional. Again, this is a game that I've covered in more detail in a separate video, and I'll make sure I link it in the description. Finally, in first place, we have Guild Wars 2, which probably doesn't come as much of a surprise, to be honest. Guild Wars is a game that has essentially been built from the ground up for casual players to enjoy, and that's pretty evident in most of the game's features. For a 2012 game, it still looks pretty good, and I think the fact that they went for a semi-realistic art style has really worked in their favour. It just hasn't aged as fast as some of the games that went for super realistic graphics. The newer zones featured in the 2017 Path of Fire expansion look particularly good in my opinion. Just remember to check out the system requirements as they did increase for Path of Fire. As with many of the more casual-friendly MMOs, one of the key strengths of the game is its storyline. ArenaNet have created a very lore-rich universe of Guild Wars, and it's easy to become immersed in the storyline. Sometimes the plot can be a little obvious, particularly in the early stages, but that doesn't make it any less enjoyable, and I definitely felt invested in the key characters, which isn't typical for me when it comes to MMOs. There's also a good amount of voice acting, which, as I've said before, is a pretty huge factor for me when it comes to story immersion. The way that questing's handled in Guild Wars is fairly unique, and I think it's pretty well suited to casual players. Rather than travelling between quest hubs and carrying out your typical kill or fetch quests, you essentially just stumble upon quests wherever you go. Once you complete a quest, you immediately receive the experience and reward, and then you can just move on to the next one. You don't even have to hand it in. If you complete all of the content that's available in a particular zone, then you get an extra special reward for your efforts, which I think is a nice touch. I'm not saying it's the perfect system or anything, and it does feel a little repetitive after a while. However, it's one of the few MMO questing systems that allows you to feel that you've achieved something even if you only have 20 or 30 minutes to play, and that makes it ideal for casual players. Also, pretty much everything you do in game will grant you experience, so you'll continue to progress whether you're questing, crafting, gathering, or taking part in side activities such as the game's jumping puzzles. Again, this really helps casual players to not get left behind when it comes to leveling. Once you reach level cap in Guild Wars, then it doesn't take a great deal of work to start participating in PvE endgame, at least not relative to a lot of other MMOs. There's a certain level of skill required to participate in the more advanced endgame content, but it's certainly not an enormous grind just to gear up for it. This makes PvE endgame far more accessible to casual players. Just make sure you learn how to dodge properly. I never quite mastered it, and it got me killed more often than I'd care to admit. Speaking of the game's combat, it is actually quite unique. It's a blend of traditional tab targeting and action combat, which from that description sounds fairly similar to the way that I describe combat in ESO, but it actually plays out very differently. As I suggested with ESO, the best way to find out is just to go and try it. That's the only way that you're going to get a true understanding of if it works for you. Also, Guild Wars is totally free to try right now, so there's not really much to lose. PvP in Guild Wars can be quite involved, and you may need to invest a decent amount of time to not feel like a total potato. However, one big thing that's in favour of casual players is that gear provides no advantage in PvP. People can't just steamroll you by simply grinding the most powerful gear all day while you're at work. It's actually entirely skill based, and you can always expect a level playing field. Another big draw for casual players when it comes to Guild Wars 2 is the community. As the game is very much focused on casual friendly content, you'll find that the community is very welcoming of new players, and you just don't get a lot of the elitist nonsense that you get of some other games. To be fair, the same can be said about the ESO community, and even the WoW community if you know where to look. However, I feel that the Guild Wars 2 community is exceptional for this, and to me, MMOs are all about building great communities. As with the other games, I've covered Guild Wars 2 in more detail in another video, which I'll link in the description. I actually think that the top 3 games in this list are very closely tied for first place, so it's definitely worth doing a good amount of research and giving each game a try before settling on one. You might even find that you hate them all. You certainly wouldn't be the first, and I'm sure we're going to get plenty of comments that tell us just that. Ultimately, finding the MMO that really clicks with you is a very personal thing, and that's why I think it's worth just trying as many as possible. Your perfect game might end up being something super niche that doesn't often make it onto this kind of list. So keep searching, keep experimenting, and be prepared to kiss a few frogs before you find the right one. Anyway, you have my thoughts on the top 5 MMOs for casual players. Let me know yours in the comments down below. Also, if you want to get regular content on both current and upcoming MMOs, then please consider subscribing to my channel, and I will see you next time.